James Holloway wiped sweat from his brow as dust particles danced in the beam of his flashlight. The demolition of St. Augustine's Psychiatric Hospital had been postponed for the third time this month. As project manager for urban renewal development, his patience was wearing thin. "This place gives me the creeps," muttered Frank, the senior engineer, as they moved through the main corridor of the abandoned asylum, built in 1917 and shuttered in 1965. The massive Gothic structure had stood vacant for 10 years, becoming a crumbling monument to Detroit's more prosperous past. "We need to check the structural integrity of the East Wing basement before bringing in the heavy equipment tomorrow," James replied, checking the blueprints in his hand. "City inspector won't sign off until we verify it's safe." The air grew colder as they descended the concrete stairs, their footsteps echoing through the emptiness. The basement smelled of mildew and something else, something clinical and astringent, that had seeped into the walls decades ago. "According to these plans, there should be a utility room to the right," James said, sweeping his flashlight across the peeling walls. "Wait, what's that?" The beam illuminated a narrow doorway partially concealed behind a rusted storage rack. It wasn't marked on any of the blueprints. "That's strange," Frank murmured, moving closer. "This doesn't match the original plans." James pushed the rack aside with a metallic screech that reverberated through the darkness. The door behind it was solid steel with a small reinforced window. Unlike the other doors they'd encountered, this one had multiple locks and a faded sign that read, "Authorized personnel only." "This section isn't in any of the documentation we received," James said, flipping through the blueprints again. "Could be an old storage area for medical equipment." Frank's flashlight beam caught something through the small window, the glint of metal. "There's something in there." With effort, they forced the rusted door open. The hinges protested loudly as if warning them away. When they stepped inside, both men froze. The room extended far beyond what should have been possible according to the blueprints. Rows of wheelchairs lined both walls, positioned as if their occupants had simply vanished mid-conversation. Medical equipment stood untouched, covered in decades of dust. Beds with leather restraints were arranged in neat rows, their mattresses rotted through. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered. "It's like they just locked the door and walked away." James moved deeper into the room, his flashlight revealing more disturbing details. Personal belongings still in bedside drawers, patient files scattered across a nurse's station, a calendar frozen on March 1965. "Frank, this isn't on any of the decommissioning records. According to the paperwork, all patients were transferred before closure." James picked up a patient file, the pages yellow and brittle. "Elizabeth Winters, admitted January 1942. Treatment, electroshock therapy, and isolation. Status, ongoing care required." "Maybe they missed a section during the evacuation," Frank suggested, though his voice betrayed his unease. James shook his head. "That's impossible. This place was supposed to be empty when they locked it up." He moved his flashlight to the far end of the room, revealing another door. "There's more." Frank grabbed his arm. "James, we should report this before going further." "If there was some kind of cover-up, we're already behind schedule," James interrupted. "Let's just document everything and notify the Historical Society tomorrow." As they approached the second door, a cold draft swept through the room. The wheelchairs seemed to shift slightly, though neither man mentioned it. The second door opened into a corridor that wasn't on any blueprint, a hidden floor that extended beneath the entire east wing. "This is impossible," James muttered, consulting the plans again. "This entire section doesn't exist on paper." Patient rooms lined both sides of the hallway, their doors ajar. In one room, a half-finished game of chess sat on a table, as if the players had stepped away for just a moment. In another, children's drawings covered the walls, crude, disturbing images of shadowy figures standing over beds. "I don't like this," Frank said, his voice echoing. "Something's not right." A metallic squeak behind them made both men spin around. One of the wheelchairs had moved, now positioned in the middle of the hallway when seconds before it had been against the wall. "Did you bump into that?" James asked, his voice strained. Frank shook his head slowly. "I wasn't even close to it." Before either could speak again, the distinct sound of wheels rolling across linoleum came from the darkness behind them. The next morning, James returned to the asylum alone. He'd spent a sleepless night researching St. Augustine's history, disturbed by what they'd discovered. Frank had refused to accompany him, insisting they wait for proper authorities. "This place should have been documented before demolition," James muttered to himself, setting up his camera and additional lights in the hidden basement area. As a former history major before switching to urban development, he couldn't ignore the historical significance of their find. He'd brought a small digital recorder, intending to document everything methodically. St. Augustine's Psychiatric Hospital, hidden basement level, July 12, 1975. This area appears to have been sealed off during the 1965 closure. The patient files had kept him awake all night. Elizabeth Winters wasn't the only one whose records indicated ongoing treatment after the hospital's official closure. Dozens of patients were unaccounted for in the transfer documentation. What happened to these people? James set up his equipment in what appeared to be the administrative office of this hidden floor. Filing cabinets lined the walls and a large desk dominated the center of the room. He pulled on a pair of gloves before carefully opening the first drawer. Inside were hundreds of files, meticulously organized by date and treatment type. Many were labeled with a red stamp, Special Research Initiative. He selected one at random and began reading. Patient number 117, Thomas Green. Treatment protocol experimental. Subject demonstrates reduced aggression following procedure 6. Memory impairment significant but acceptable. Recommend advancing to stage 2 despite complications in previous subjects. The clinical language couldn't disguise the horror of what James was reading. These weren't standard treatments, they were experiments. Page after page detailed procedures that went well beyond accepted medical practice, even for the 1960s. As he photographed the documents, a pattern emerged. Beginning in 1959, a doctor, Lawrence Weiss, had initiated a research program focusing on behavioral modification through neurological intervention. The procedures grew increasingly invasive, with notes documenting unexpected responses and terminal outcomes. They were experimenting on these patients, James whispered into his recorder. And when the hospital was ordered to close, they just what? Sealed off this section? A noise from the corridor outside made him freeze. It sounded like soft wheels rolling across the floor, stopping just outside the office door. James held his breath, listening intently. After several seconds of silence, he slowly moved to the doorway and peered out. The hallway was empty, but one of the wheelchairs was now positioned directly across from the office, facing the door as if someone had been watching him. Yesterday it had been at the far end of the corridor. "Hello?" James called out, his voice echoing down the empty hallway. "Is someone there?" Only silence answered him. He approached the wheelchair cautiously, examining it for any explanation of its movement. The ancient device was heavy and rusted. It would take considerable force to move it silently. Back in the office, James discovered a locked drawer in the desk. After several minutes of searching, he found a ring of keys hidden behind a loose panel in the wall. The smallest key fit the drawer. Inside was a leather-bound journal, Dr. Weiss's personal notes, far less clinical than the official records. James began reading, his unease growing with each page. March 10, 1964. The board is threatening to cut our funding again. They don't understand the importance of our work. If we can perfect the procedure, the military applications alone would ensure unlimited resources. The subjects from Ward C have proven most receptive. Their prior conditions make them ideal candidates. No one asks questions when they experience complications. April 18, 1964, subject number 133. Demonstrated remarkable abilities following the procedure. For nearly 30 minutes she appeared capable of influencing physical objects without contact. Unfortunately, the strain proved too much for her system. I've ordered a full autopsy to determine why her brain tissue deteriorated so rapidly. February 2, 1965. Closure notice received today. We have 6 weeks to transfer all patients and shut down operations. Richardson assures me our special project can continue with military funding if we can demonstrate consistent results. We'll transfer the general population but maintain our research subjects in the secured facility. The orderlies have been instructed to report that all patients have been relocated. The final entry was dated March 17, 1965, written in a shaky, hurried hand. Something has gone wrong. Subject number 117 influenced the others somehow. The orderlies found Matthews with his skull crushed, though no one had entered his room. Wheeler claims he saw empty wheelchairs moving in formation down the hallway. The subjects refuse to speak, but they watch us constantly. Richardson is sending a containment team tomorrow. I've ordered maximum sedation for all subjects until then. There were no further entries. Whatever happened after March 17th remained undocumented. James sat back, his hands trembling slightly. The hospital had officially closed on March 18, 1965, the day after Dr. Weiss's final entry. As James contemplated the implications, the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. His breath began to fog in front of him. The lights he'd set up flickered once, twice, then stabilized. Behind him, the door to the office slowly began to close. The door slammed shut with a finality that made James jump. He rushed to it, pulling on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The rational part of his mind suggested a draft or settling of the old building. but the journal's contents had awakened something primal in him, a deep-seated fear that he wasn't alone. "Frank?" he called out, hoping his colleague had changed his mind and followed him. "Is anyone there?" His voice echoed back mockingly. Quote, the lights flickered again, longer this time, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When they stabilized, James noticed his camera had stopped recording. The display showed only static. He tried the door again, putting his shoulder into it. Something was holding it shut from the outside, something strong. James took a deep breath, forcing himself to think logically. There had to be a rational explanation. Old buildings settled, doors stuck, equipment malfunctioned. As if responding to his thoughts, a whisper drifted through the room. "They left us here." James spun around, heart hammering. "Who's there?" The room remained empty, but the temperature continued to drop. His recording equipment shut down completely, and one of the lights exploded with a sharp pop, showering glass onto the floor. Keeping his back to the wall, James slid toward his bag, intending to grab his flashlight. Before he could reach it, the remaining light flickered and went out, leaving him in complete darkness. In the sudden silence, he could hear breathing, not his own, but slow and deliberate, coming from multiple directions. James fumbled for his cigarette lighter, finally producing a small flame that cast long, dancing shadows across the room. The filing cabinets had all opened, their contents strewn across the floor. Dr. Weiss's journal lay open on the desk, though James was certain he'd closed it. In the feeble light of his lighter, new words appeared on the previously blank page after the final entry. "They sealed us in. Help us." The handwriting wasn't Dr. Weiss's. It looked like it had been written by multiple people, the letters overlapping and intersecting in a chaotic pattern. James backed toward the door again, abandoning any pretense of scientific curiosity. Whatever was happening here, he wanted no part of it. To his surprise, the door now opened easily, as if it had never been stuck. The corridor outside was transformed. Where before there had been decay and abandonment, now the hallway appeared almost pristine, as if he'd stepped back in time. The linoleum gleamed under his lighter's flame, and the walls were a clean institutional green rather than peeling and water-stained. And the wheelchairs, all of them, now formed a perfect line down the center of the hallway, facing him. "This isn't real," James whispered to himself. "This can't be real." From the darkness beyond his small circle of light came the sound of wheels, rolling slowly toward him. Then another set joined in, and another, until the hallway filled with the sound of approaching wheelchairs, though none in his view moved. James backed up, nearly stumbling over his own feet. As he retreated, whispers began to fill the corridor. "Don't leave us. We've been waiting. He promised we'd be special. Look what they did to us." The voices seemed to come from the wheelchairs themselves, though they remained empty. James broke into a run, heading for the stairs they'd used yesterday. Behind him, the squeaking of wheels accelerated as if in pursuit. When he reached the stairwell door, he risked a glance back. The corridor was now filled with wheelchairs moving on their own, rolling toward him with purpose. In the lead was a chair that hadn't been there before, newer than the others, with strange modifications including electrical components attached to the armrests. James yanked open the door and practically fell up the stairs, not stopping until he reached the main floor. Sunlight streamed through broken windows, momentarily blinding him after the darkness below. He gulped in the warm summer air, trying to calm his racing heart. "I'm losing my mind," he muttered, leaning against a wall. The journal, the voices, the moving wheelchairs, none of it could be real. He'd been working too hard, sleeping too little. The stress of the project delays was getting to him. Yet when he checked his watch, only 20 minutes had passed since he'd entered the hidden floor. It had felt like hours. James gathered his composure and decided to leave. He would come back with Frank and a proper team people who could document everything objectively. As he headed toward the main entrance, a voice called out behind him, "Mr. Holloway." James turned slowly. At the end of the hallway stood a man in a white lab coat, his features indistinct in the shadows. Behind him, just visible in the darkness, was a line of wheelchairs. "We've been expecting you," the figure said. "Dr. Weiss always said someone would find us eventually." The man stepped forward into a patch of sunlight, and James stifled a scream. The figure wore a doctor's coat and badge, but his face was wrong, distorted, and incomplete, as if someone had tried to reconstruct human features without quite understanding how they should look. "You see, the experiments never stopped," the figure said, his mouth moving unnaturally with the words. "We continued our work even after they sealed the doors." Behind him, the wheelchairs began to move forward in perfect unison. Frank Bennett sipped his coffee nervously at the small diner across from the asylum. He'd been waiting for James for over an hour, watching the abandoned building with growing unease. After their discovery yesterday, he'd spent the night researching St. Augustine's history, uncovering disturbing patterns that made him regret ever taking this demolition contract. "More coffee, hun?" asked the waitress, a woman in her 60s named Doris who, according to her earlier conversation, had lived in the neighborhood her entire life. Please, Frank nodded, not taking his eyes off the building. You mentioned earlier you remembered when the hospital closed. Doris glanced at the asylum as she refilled his cup. Sure do. I was just a teenager, but it was big news around here. One day it was operating like normal, the next day ambulances and buses were taking patients away. Then nothing place just sat there empty. Did you ever hear anything strange about it? Any rumors about what went on there? Doris lowered her voice. Well, my uncle worked there as a janitor in the early 60s. He used to talk about a special ward they didn't let regular staff into. Said sometimes he'd hear screaming coming from behind those doors. Frank felt a chill. Did he ever mention a doctor named Weiss? The cup Doris was holding clattered against the saucer. How do you know that name? We found some of his records yesterday, Frank admitted. My colleague went back this morning to document everything before demolition. Doris looked around the empty diner, then slid into the booth across from him. Listen, there's something not right about that place. When they closed it down, people noticed things didn't add up. The hospital administrator claimed all patients had been transferred, but families came looking for relatives who never arrived at other facilities. Missing patients? Frank leaned forward. At least 30 that I know of. My neighbor's sister was there, Margaret Collins. Mild depression after her husband died. Nothing serious. When the hospital closed, they told her family she'd been transferred to Lakeside, but when they went to visit, Margaret wasn't there. No record she'd ever arrived. Frank felt sick. What happened? Official story was that records got mixed up in the transfer. They claimed Margaret had actually been sent to a facility in Ohio, but by the time her family checked, they were told she'd died of pneumonia. Very convenient. Doris's eyes hardened. There were others like her. Mostly people without many connections, the ones nobody important would miss. Frank glanced at his watch again. James should have been back by now. Your friend shouldn't be in there alone, Doris said, following his gaze. Strange things happen in that building. Kids who sneak in looking for thrills come out different, if they come out at all. As if on cue, the asylum's main doors burst open. James stumbled out into the sunlight, running at full speed across the overgrown lawn. Even from this distance, Frank could see the terror on his face. I need to go, Frank said, throwing money on the table and rushing outside. James saw him and changed direction, nearly collapsing against Frank's truck. His face was ashen, and a thin trickle of blood ran from his nose. We need to leave, James gasped. Now. What happened? Frank demanded, helping him into the passenger seat. James just shook his head, his hands trembling violently. Drive. Please, just drive. As Frank started the engine, he glanced back at the asylum. In one of the upper windows, a figure stood watching them, a man in what appeared to be a white coat. As the truck pulled away, Frank could have sworn he saw wheelchairs lined up behind the figure, their empty seats facing the window. Once they were several blocks away, James began to speak, his words tumbling out in a disjointed narrative. He described finding Weiss's journal, the voices, the moving wheelchairs, and the encounter with the figure who claimed the experiments had never stopped. It's impossible, Frank said, though his voice lacked conviction. The place has been empty for 10 years. I saw them, Frank. Whatever Weiss did to those patients. They're still there. Not alive, not dead, but something in between. James rubbed his temples. And they're angry. Frank remembered what Doris had said about the missing patients. We need to report this to someone. The police, maybe. James laughed bitterly. And tell them what? That we've found ghosts in wheelchairs? That a mad doctor's experiments created something that's still active 10 years after the hospital closed? They'll think we're crazy. Then we document everything, get evidence. We can. I tried that, James interrupted. None of my equipment worked properly down there. The camera, the recorder, all useless. They drove in silence for several minutes. Finally, Frank spoke. The demolition is scheduled for tomorrow. Whatever's in there will be destroyed. James stared out the window. I don't think it works that way. Whatever Weiss created, I don't think it's bound to the building itself. It's bound to the patients, or what's left of them. What are you saying? I'm saying those experiments did something to those people, changed them fundamentally. And if we tear down those walls, we might just set them free. Frank pulled the truck over and turned to face his friend. So what do we do? Before James could answer, a familiar sound reached them, the soft squeak of wheelchair wheels on pavement. Both men turned to look through the back window of the truck. A block behind them, a single wheelchair sat in the middle of the road, empty but positioned as if someone had just been using it. As they watched, it began to move toward them, picking up speed. Drive, James whispered. Drive now. Frank didn't need to be told twice. 3 days later, James sat in his apartment surrounded by research materials. The demolition of St. Augustine had been postponed again officially due to potential historical significance. requiring further evaluation, but James knew the real reason. Neither he nor Frank had been willing to return to the site, instead fabricating paperwork issues to delay the project. The apartment walls were covered with newspaper clippings, photocopies of hospital records, and a map tracking the 37 patients who had allegedly been transferred but never arrived at other facilities. James had been unable to sleep, driven by a compulsion to understand what had happened in that hidden ward. A knock at the door made him jump. Through the peephole, he saw Frank, looking as haggard as James felt. "You look terrible," Frank said as James let him in. "Thanks. You're not exactly a vision of health yourself." James gestured to the chaotic display on his walls. "I've been connecting the dots." Frank surveyed the materials with growing concern. "This is obsessive, James. Maybe we should just walk away from this project. Let someone else handle the demolition. It's too late for that," James replied, pointing to a newspaper article dated April 1965. "Look at this. 1 month after St. Augustine officially closed, Dr. Lawrence Weiss and 5 other staff members died in a car accident. Their vehicle went off. Riverdale Bridge with no signs of mechanical failure or driver error. Could be coincidence. All 6 of them worked in the hidden ward." James moved to another section of wall. And here, Margaret Collins, the woman Doris mentioned. Her death certificate lists pneumonia as the cause, but her sister insisted on an independent autopsy. The results showed unexplained brain tissue deterioration identical to what Weiss described in his journal. Frank sat heavily on the couch. "So what are you saying? Weiss's experiments created some kind of psychic phenomenon?" "I think it was supposed to. The journal entries suggest they were trying to develop psychokinetic abilities, moving objects with the mind. The military was interested." James ran a hand through his unwashed hair. "But something went wrong. The subjects developed abilities they couldn't control. And when the hospital was ordered to close, Weiss had a problem on his hands, so he, just sealed them in?" "According to that final journal entry, something happened the day before closure. The subjects somehow turned on the staff. I think ... double quotes." James hesitated. "I think Weiss and his team tried to eliminate the problem by sealing the patients in that hidden floor and reporting them transferred or deceased." "But that's murder," Frank whispered. "Yes. And then a month later, Weiss and 5 staff members die in an inexplicable accident." James pointed to a map of Detroit. "The bridge where they died? It's less than a mile from the hospital." A chill settled over the room as the implication became clear. "You think the patients somehow caused the accident? From inside the sealed ward?" James nodded slowly. "Whatever abilities they developed, they weren't limited by physical barriers. But they were trapped, their bodies confined to that hidden floor while their minds could reach beyond it." "This is insane," Frank muttered. "You realize how this sounds?" "I know exactly how it sounds. But we both saw those wheelchairs move. We both felt something in that place." James pulled out a folder he hadn't shown Frank yet. "And then there's this. I found records of unusual incidents around the hospital since its closure. People passing by report hearing voices. 3 teenagers who broke in on a dare in 1970 were found catatonic, unable to speak about what they'd seen. One of them still hasn't recovered." Frank was silent for a long moment. "So what do? We can't just leave them there. But we can't let them out either." "I've been thinking about that," James replied, moving to his desk where an old book lay open. Weiss's experiments were based on earlier research by a Dr. Elizabeth Morgan. Her work suggested that psychic abilities were linked to electrical patterns in the brain that could be enhanced through specific stimuli. What does that have to do with our situation? Morgan also theorized that these patterns could be disrupted by creating a grounding effect, essentially neutralizing the electrical charge that allows the phenomena to manifest. James tapped the book. "If we could create a strong enough grounding circuit throughout the hidden floor, it might neutralize whatever energy is sustaining them." Frank looked skeptical. "You want to exorcise the ghosts with science?" "They're not ghosts," James insisted. "They're people, or what's left of them, trapped in a state between life and death by unethical experiments. We have a responsibility to help them. By grounding them, you realize how thin this theory is. Do you have a better idea? Because in 2 weeks, demolition crews will go into that building, and whatever's trapped there might get out." James leaned forward. "Those wheelchairs moved on their own. That presence followed us out of the building. What do you think will happen when bulldozers start tearing down walls?" Frank stared out the window, considering. "Fine. Assuming this isn't completely insane, what would we need to do?" "We create a circuit using copper wire running through the entire hidden floor, connected to multiple grounding rods driven deep into the earth." James pulled out a sketch he'd made based on what they'd seen. "We'd need to work fast, and we'd need to do it at sunrise when the energy should be at its weakest point. And you think this will help them move on?" James nodded. If Morgan's theories are correct, it should disrupt the energy pattern keeping them in this state of limbo. They'd be free of whatever Weiss did to them. Frank still looked unconvinced, but he nodded slowly. I'll help. Not because I believe this will work, but because we need to do something before demolition begins. As they discussed the details of their plan, neither man noticed the slight movement of the window curtain behind them, swaying gently as if someone had just passed by, even though the window was closed and there was no breeze in the room. The next morning, Frank and James met at a hardware store across town, far from the asylum. They filled their cart with copper wire, grounding rods, tools, and electrical equipment. The clerk raised an eyebrow at the quantity but asked no questions when James explained they were rewiring an old house. Are you sure about this? Frank asked as they loaded the supplies into his truck. We could still go to the authorities and tell them what? James countered. That we need to perform a pseudo-scientific ritual on a sealed hospital ward to free trapped consciousnesses? We'd end up in a psychiatric hospital ourselves. Frank couldn't argue with that logic. What about Doris? She seemed to know something about the place. I tracked down some of the families of the missing patients, James replied. They've been trying to get answers for 10 years with no success. Whatever happened at St. Augustine, someone made sure it stayed buried. They worked methodically through the day, preparing the equipment according to the specifications in Dr. Morgan's research. The theory was simple. Create a conductive pathway that would channel the electrical energy sustaining the phenomena into the ground, dissipating it harmlessly. As evening approached, they agreed to meet at the asylum at dawn. James returned to his apartment, intending to get some rest before what promised to be a difficult day, but sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the wheelchairs moving in formation down that darkened hallway. Around midnight, his phone rang. Frank's voice came through, tense and frightened. Something's happening, James, I think. I think they know what we're planning. What do you mean, what's happening? My apartment, things are moving. Just small things at first, keys sliding across the table, books falling from shelves. But it's getting worse. Frank's voice dropped to a whisper. There's a wheelchair outside my building. It wasn't there an hour ago and no one's around it. It's just waiting. James moved to his window, peering out at the empty street below. I don't see anything here yet. They're focusing on me, Frank said. Maybe because I was more skeptical. I don't know. But a crash sounded in the background. Jesus. My cabinet just tipped over by itself. Get out of there, James urged. Come to my place. We'll figure this out together. I'll try, but I don't think they'll let me leave. Frank's voice had taken on a strange, distant quality. They're in my head, James. I can hear them whispering. They're saying they've been waiting for someone to find them. That we're part of something that was set in motion years ago. Frank, listen to me. Fight it. Whatever influence they have, you can resist it. Did you know, Frank said conversationally as if they were discussing the weather, that Dr. Weiss selected his subjects very carefully? He chose people with pre-existing conditions that mimicked the abilities he wanted to enhance. People with temporal lobe epilepsy who reported feeling presences, people with schizophrenia who heard voices. He took their symptoms and weaponized them. Frank, how do you know that? That wasn't in the journal. A soft laugh came through the phone. They're telling me, James. They're showing me what happened to them. The procedures. The pain. Do you know what it feels like to have electrodes implanted in your brain while you're still conscious enough to feel it? James felt cold sweat breaking out across his body. Frank, where are you right now? I'm coming to get you. It's too late for that. They've been waiting 10 years for someone to find them, to free them, but not the way you're planning. Frank's voice dropped to a whisper. They need new vessels, James. Their bodies are long gone, but their minds are stronger than ever. The line went dead. James immediately tried calling back, but there was no answer. He grabbed his car keys, intending to drive to Frank's apartment, but stopped when he noticed something outside his window that hadn't been there before. A wheelchair sat on the sidewalk directly below his apartment, empty but positioned as if waiting for an occupant. As he watched, it rotated slowly until it faced upward toward his window. James backed away, heart pounding. Frank's words echoed in his mind. They need new vessels. The implications were terrifying. Whatever remained of those patients wasn't looking for release. They were looking for a way out, a way to continue their existence. The phone rang again, making him jump. He answered without checking the caller ID, hoping it was Frank. Hello? James said cautiously. Mr. Holloway? An unfamiliar female voice responded. My name is Catherine Winters. My mother was Elizabeth Winters, a patient at St. Augustine Psychiatric Hospital. James recognized the name from the first patient file he'd examined in the hidden ward. How did you get this number? Your colleague, Mr. Bennett, called me about an hour ago. He said you'd found evidence of what happened to my mother and the others. Her voice was tense. Is it true? After all these years, do you know what happened to them? James hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. I found records suggesting your mother was among a group of patients who weren't transferred when the hospital closed. But the situation is complicated. Mr. Bennett said something else, Catherine continued. He said you were planning to set them free tomorrow morning. What exactly does that mean? Alarm bells rang in James's mind. The Frank he knew wouldn't have contacted the families or revealed their plans. Miss Winters, when exactly did Mr. Bennett call you? About an hour ago, like I said. He seemed strange. Kept switching between referring to my mother in the third person and the first person. At one point he said, "We've been waiting so long to be found." Her voice cracked. "What's happening, Mr. Holloway? What did you find in that hospital?" James closed his eyes, the horrible truth dawning on him. Frank had been compromised. Whatever consciousness remained in that hidden ward had found a way to influence him, perhaps even control him. Miss Winters, I need you to listen carefully. Don't speak to Frank again if he calls. Don't go near St. Augustine Hospital under any circumstances. What we found there, it's dangerous. My mother has been missing for 10 years, Mr. Holloway. If there's any chance she's still alive— She's not alive, James interrupted, the words harsh but necessary. Not in any way that matters. What's left of her and the others is something else now, something that shouldn't be released. There was a long pause before Catherine spoke again, her voice cold. You don't get to make that decision, Mr. Holloway. Those are people with families who've been waiting for answers. If you won't help them, others will. The line went dead before James could respond. He immediately tried calling back, but like with Frank, there was no answer. James moved to the window again. The wheelchair was gone, but he had a sinking feeling that the night's events were just beginning. His suspicions were confirmed when his phone rang once more. This time it was Doris from the diner. You need to come quickly, she said without preamble. There's something happening at the hospital. People are gathering family members of the missing patients. Someone's been calling them, telling them their loved ones are still there and need help getting out. James cursed under his breath. How many? At least 20 that I can see from the diner. They're bringing tools. Looks like they plan to break in. Doris's voice lowered. And there's something else. Wheelchairs have been appearing all over the neighborhood since sundown. Empty wheelchairs just rolling down the streets toward the hospital. Keep everyone away from that building, James urged. Whatever's in there, it's not what they think. It's not their loved ones, not anymore. I've tried telling them, Doris replied, frustration evident in her voice. But they don't want to listen. 10 years of unanswered questions. Mr. Holloway. They want closure. They'll get something much worse if they break in there. James grabbed his jacket. I'm on my way. Try to stall them until I arrive. As he raced to his car, James noticed more wheelchairs converging on the main road, rolling steadily toward the direction of the asylum. No one was pushing them. No mechanism drove them forward. Yet they moved with purpose, some keeping pace with passing cars. The 20-minute drive to St. Augustine took just 12 minutes. As James approached, he could see flashlight beams dancing across the asylum's dark facade. A small crowd had gathered at the main gates, most of them middle-aged or elderly, the families of those who had disappeared a decade ago. James parked hastily and ran toward the group. He spotted Doris trying to reason with a gray-haired man who was working on the chain securing the gates. You don't understand what you're doing, James called out as he approached. Please listen to me. I'm the project manager for the demolition. What I found inside that building— We know what you found, interrupted a woman who stepped forward from the crowd. James recognized her voice immediately. Catherine Winters. You found our family members who were abandoned and forgotten. That's not what happened, James insisted. Dr. Weiss was conducting illegal experiments. The patients in that hidden ward were subjected to procedures that changed them. What remains inside isn't human anymore. That's a convenient explanation for leaving them sealed up, said the man with the bolt cutters. My brother Thomas has been trapped in there for 10 years. If he's alive, we're getting him out. If he's dead, he deserves a proper burial. James recognized the name Thomas Green, patient number 117 from Weiss's journal, the subject who had allegedly influenced the others. Your brother was part of an experimental program, James said carefully. According to the records, he developed abilities that the staff couldn't control. I believe he and the other patients were responsible for the deaths of Dr. Weiss and 5 staff members after they were sealed in. That's absurd, Catherine scoffed. You're talking about some kind of supernatural revenge? These were vulnerable people who were abandoned, and explained the wheelchairs. James challenged, gesturing to the street behind them. The group turned to look. In the dim glow of the streetlights, at least a dozen empty wheelchairs had gathered, arranged in a semicircle as if watching the confrontation. Several people in the crowd stepped back, murmuring in alarm. Others crossed themselves or clutched religious symbols. That's just someone playing a prank, Catherine said, though her voice had lost its certainty. No one's touching those chairs, Doris said quietly. They've been moving on their own all evening. As if triggered by her words, the wheelchairs began to advance, rolling slowly toward the group. The crowd broke apart, people backing away in fear. Only Catherine and the man with the bolt cutters remained by the gate. "Thomas?" Catherine called out uncertainly. "Elizabeth, is that you?" One wheelchair moved ahead of the other, stopping directly in front of Catherine. It was newer than the rest, with electrical components attached to the armrests, the same chair James had seen leading the pursuit in the hospital corridor. "Mom," Catherine whispered, reaching out a trembling hand toward the empty seat. "Don't touch it." James lunged forward, but he was too late. As Catherine's fingers made contact with the armrest, her body went rigid. Her eyes rolled back, showing only whites, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed completely. "Catherine has been telling the truth," she said in a flat, emotionless tone that was nothing like her previous speech. "We have been waiting for someone to find us, waiting for vessels strong enough to contain us." The man with the bolt cutters backed away, dropping his tool. "What the hell?" Catherine's head turned toward him with unnatural smoothness. "Hello, David. Thomas has missed you. He'll be with you soon." James grabbed Catherine's arm, trying to pull her away from the wheelchair. "Fight it. Whatever's controlling you, you can push it out." Catherine's face twisted into a grimace, a brief flash of her true self breaking through. "Help me," she gasped. "There's something in my head." So many voices, ... double quotes. Then the moment passed and the vacant expression returned. "We learned so much in that dark place," she continued in the emotionless voice. Weiss wanted to create weapons, but he created something far beyond his understanding. We evolved. We transcended. The other wheelchairs had now formed a complete circle around the group, cutting off any escape. One by one, they began to move towards specific individuals in the crowd. "Run!" James shouted. "Everyone get away from here now." Some people broke through the circle of wheelchairs, fleeing toward their cars. Others stood frozen in fear or confusion. As each wheelchair made contact with a person, the same transformation occurred: rigid bodies, rolled-back eyes, voices that were not their own. James backed away, pulling Doris with him. "We need to get out of here. What about those people?" she asked, gesturing to those who had already been affected. "We can't help them now. We need to warn others, keep more people from coming here." James continued retreating, his eyes fixed on the growing number of possessed individuals. They had nearly reached his car when Frank stepped out from behind it, blocking their path. "Going somewhere, James?" Frank asked, his voice carrying the same flat quality as Catherine's. "The others are eager to meet you. After all, you're the one who found us. In a way, you've made all this possible." "Frank, if you're still in there, fight it," James pleaded. A flicker of recognition crossed Frank's face. "James, I can't. They're too strong, ... double quotes, then the vacancy returned. "Your friend is still here, but he's no longer in control. None of them are. And soon neither will you be." James grabbed a fallen branch from the ground, holding it between himself and Frank. "Stay back." Frank smiled, an expression that looked wrong on his face. "We don't need physical contact anymore. That was just the beginning. Now that we have enough vessels, we can reach further." James felt it then, a pressure in his mind, like fingers probing at the edges of his consciousness. Whispers filled his thoughts, dozens of voices speaking simultaneously. "Let us in. We've been so alone. Join us. Become part of something greater." James clutched his head, dropping to one knee as the pressure intensified. Beside him, Doris screamed, her hands pressed to her temples. "You can't fight it," Frank said calmly. "No one can. Dr. Weiss tried to create weapons, but instead he created gods. And gods need worshippers." Through the haze of pain and the cacophony of voices, James remembered Dr. Morgan's theory about grounding the electrical energy. He had copper wire in his car, not enough for the entire hospital, but perhaps enough for a desperate measure. "Doris," he gasped, "my car, ... trunk, ... copper wire, ... double quotes." Doris was struggling against the mental assault herself, but she nodded, crawling toward the car. Frank made no move to stop her, apparently confident in the inevitable outcome. "The connection works both ways," James said through gritted teeth, forcing himself to focus on Frank rather than the voices in his head. "If you can get into our minds, we can get into yours." Frank's confident expression faltered slightly. "You can't possibly understand what we've become." "I understand enough," James replied, buying time as Doris retrieved the copper wire from his trunk. Weiss's journal explained the theory. "You're sustained by electrical patterns that can be disrupted." For the first time, genuine emotion crossed Frank's fear. "You wouldn't dare. You'd kill your friend." "Frank would rather die than live as a puppet," James said, hoping it was true. He noticed Doris had returned with the wire and was unwinding it behind Frank's back. The pressure in James's mind intensified, becoming almost unbearable. The voices grew louder, more insistent. His vision began to darken around the edges. "Now!" he shouted with his last bit of strength. Doris lunged forward, wrapping the copper wire around Frank's legs and torso. As the wire made contact, a strange sound filled the air, not quite a scream, but a high-pitched electrical whine that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Frank's body convulsed, and he collapsed to the ground. Around them, the possessed individuals all reacted similarly, dropping to their knees or falling completely. The wheelchairs, which had been advancing steadily, suddenly stopped. The pressure in James's mind vanished instantly. He gasped in relief, crawling toward Frank's prone form. "Frank? Can you hear me?" Frank's eyes fluttered open, clear and focused for the first time since James had arrived. "James? What happened? I remember calling you and then ... nothing." "They took control of you," James explained, helping his friend sit up. "Used you to lure the families here." Frank looked around in horror at the people lying on the ground, some beginning to stir. Did I hurt anyone?" "No, but you almost did." James turned to Doris. "Thank you." "Quick thinking with the wire." Doris nodded grimly. "My uncle used to talk about Dr. Morgan's theories," said Weiss, twisted her research into something evil. As the possessed individuals began to regain consciousness, the empty wheelchairs started to move again, but this time they were retreating, rolling back toward the asylum at increasing speed. "It's not over," James realized. "We've only disrupted the connection temporarily. What do we do now?" Frank asked, struggling to his feet. James watched the wheelchairs disappearing through the asylum gates. "We finish what we started. We ground the entire hidden floor before they can recover their strength." Dawn was breaking as Frank and Doris approached the asylum's east wing entrance. They had spent the night gathering additional supplies and planning their approach. The families had been taken to a nearby hospital for observation, most with no memory of what had happened after touching the wheelchairs. "The main stairwell to the hidden floor should be through here," James said, forcing open a rusted door. "Once we're inside, we'll need to work quickly. They'll know we're coming." Frank adjusted the backpack full of copper wire and grounding equipment. "Assuming this theory is correct, how long will it take to set up the grounding circuit?" "An hour, maybe 2, James replied. "We need to run wire through the entire hidden floor and connect it to grounding rods outside the building. The hardest part will be maintaining our focus while we're in there." Doris, who had insisted on accompanying them despite their objections, clutched a makeshift pendant fashioned from copper wire. "My uncle said Dr. Morgan believed that wearing copper close to the head could help resist mental intrusion. Let's hope she was right," James muttered as they entered the asylum's dark interior. The building felt different than before, expectant, as if the very walls were watching them. Their flashlight beams cut through the gloom, illuminating dust particles that seemed to move against the air currents, swirling in patterns that followed their movements. "Do you hear that?" Frank whispered as they approached the stairwell. A faint squeaking sound echoed from below, the sound of wheelchair wheels on linoleum, moving back and forth like a pendulum. "They know we're here," James confirmed. "Stay focused. Remember why we're doing this." The descent to the hidden floor seemed to take an eternity. With each step, the air grew colder and the squeaking louder. When they finally reached the steel door with its small reinforced window, they paused to prepare themselves. "Remember the plan," James said. "I'll take the north corridor, Frank takes the south. Doris stays at the junction to maintain the connection between the circuits. No matter what you see or hear, keep laying the wire." The others nodded grimly. James took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The hidden floor was transformed. Where before there had been decay and abandonment, now the space hummed with energy. The air itself seemed to shimmer with electrical discharge. The wheelchairs were arranged in a perfect circle in the central area, slowly rotating like a carousel. In the center of the circle stood a figure, the same distorted Dr. James had seen before his escape. Now, in the improved light of their powerful flashlights, James could see that the figure wasn't solid but composed of shifting electrical patterns that approximated human form. "Welcome back, Mr. Holloway," the figure said, its voice crackling like static. "We've been expecting you. Dr. Weiss, I presume?" James replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. The figure inclined its head. "What remains of him?" "He was the first to transcend, though not by choice. The subjects he experimented on ensured he joined them permanently." "You murdered him," Doris said. "We liberated him," the figure corrected, "just as we tried to liberate your friend Frank and the others outside. Just as we will liberate you." "That's not going to happen," James stated firmly, unshouldering his backpack. "We're here to end this, to free the people you've trapped here for 10 years. The figure's approximation of a face twisted into something like amusement. "Freedom? They don't want freedom, Mr. Holloway. They want expansion. For 10 years, we've been building our strength, waiting for someone to find us. Now that you have, we're ready to move beyond these walls. Into new bodies, Frank said with disgust. Into the world, the figure corrected. What Dr. Weiss began as crude experiments in mind control has evolved into something far more significant. We've transcended individual consciousness. We've become something collective, something greater, as the figure spoke. James subtly motioned for the others to begin unspooling their copper wire. They needed to keep the entity talking while they worked. If you're so powerful, why haven't you left already? James challenged. Why wait 10 years in darkness? The figure's form flickered. Our influence was limited while we remained fractured, each consciousness pulling in different directions. But over time, we unified. We became one mind with many facets. And now, with the vessels we claimed last night, our reach has extended beyond these walls. The people you possessed have been isolated, James informed it. They're being treated as we speak. Temporary setback, the figure dismissed. The connection has been established. It cannot be broken so easily. As they conversed, Frank and Doris had managed to lay the first sections of copper wire along the walls. James needed to keep the entity distracted. What exactly do you want? He asked. If you're so evolved, what's your purpose? The figure's form expanded slightly, electrical discharges arcing between it and the nearest wheelchairs. To continue what was started here. Humanity's potential has barely been tapped, Mr. Holloway. Individual consciousness is a limitation. Imagine a world where minds connect freely, where thoughts flow between people like electricity through copper. James noticed the irony of the analogy as he began laying his own section of wire. That sounds more like a hive mind than evolution, a crude description but not entirely inaccurate. We were individuals once frightened, limited beings trapped in failing bodies and minds. Now we are one, and we are many simultaneously. The figure's attention shifted to Frank, who was working his way around the perimeter. Your friend understands. He's been part of us, if only briefly. He felt our potential. Frank faltered momentarily, his hands shaking as he connected another section of wire. I felt violation, he replied. Losing myself to something that consumed me. That was merely the transition, the figure assured him. The fear fades. The boundaries dissolve. You become something greater. As they worked and kept the entity talking, James noticed the wheelchairs had stopped their rotation. They now faced outward, forming a barrier between the central figure and the three intruders. They're onto us, he muttered to Doris as they connected their sections of wire. We need to move faster. The temperature in the room plummeted suddenly. Frost began forming on the walls and floor. The entity in the center expanded further, its electrical pattern growing more complex and intense. Enough distraction, it declared, its voice reverberating throughout the room. You cannot stop what has already begun. The wheelchairs launched forward simultaneously, racing toward the three intruders. James dove aside as one crashed into the wall where he'd been standing. Frank wasn't as fortunate. A wheelchair pinned him against a door, the pressure increasing as he struggled. Keep going, James shouted to Doris, who had frozen in fear. Complete the circuit. The entity's laughter filled the room as more wheelchairs joined the assault, becoming projectiles under its influence. Your primitive understanding of electrical grounding cannot contain what we've become. Dr. Morgan's theories applied to individual consciousness. It's not to our collective state. James dodged another wheelchair and continued laying wire, his fingers numb with cold but movements desperate with purpose. They had completed nearly 3/4 of the circuit. Just a little more. James? Frank's panicked voice cut through the chaos. Something's happening. Frank's body had gone rigid, his eyes beginning to roll back. The same signs of possession they'd witnessed outside. The entity was attempting to reclaim him. Fight it, Frank, James called out, connecting another section of wire. Focus on who you are. Doris had reached Frank and was wrapping the copper wire around his wrist, forming an improvised bracelet similar to her pendant. Frank gasped as the contact was made, slumping forward but remaining conscious. It's working, Doris realized. The copper is disrupting the connection. The entity in the center pulsed with what appeared to be anger, its form becoming more erratic. You cannot defeat us with primitive metallurgy. We are beyond physical limitations. Are you? James challenged, approaching the final connection point. Because you seem pretty determined to stop us from completing this circuit. If it's so ineffective, why bother? The assault intensified. Wheelchairs flew across the room like missiles. Medical equipment rose from the floor, hurled toward them with deadly force. The very air seemed to vibrate with the entity's rage. James reached the junction box where the internal circuit would connect to the external grounding rods. Just as he prepared to make the final connection, a powerful force lifted him from the ground, suspending him in midair. Enough, the entity thundered, its form now a swirling vortex of electrical energy. You will join us or be destroyed. James felt the pressure in his mind returning, stronger than before, thousands of voices speaking as one, demanding entry into his consciousness. His vision blurred, darkness encroaching. James. Doris's voice seemed to come from miles away. The connection, complete the connection. With his last bit of strength, James hurled the wire toward the junction box. It fell short, landing just inches from the connection point. The entity's laughter echoed through his fading consciousness. You've failed, Mr. Holloway. Now you will become part of something greater than yourself. As James's awareness began to slip away, a new voice cut through the chaos. Frank's voice, clear and determined. Not today, Frank declared, lunging forward to grab the loose wire. In one fluid motion, he connected it to the junction box, completing the circuit. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a low hum began to build, resonating through the floor and walls. The entity's form flickered, its pattern becoming unstable. What have you done? It demanded, its unified voice fracturing into individual cries of alarm. Given them back their individuality, James answered as he fell to the floor, released from the entity's hold. Broken the circuit that kept you connected. The hum increased in volume and intensity. The wheelchairs, which had been weapons moments before, crashed to the floor, inert. The entity in the center began to dissolve, its electrical pattern breaking apart into smaller, distinct formations that pulsed with independent rhythms. You've doomed them, the fracturing entity accused. Without the collective, they are nothing, lost souls with no bodies to return to. They're free, James corrected. Free to move on, instead of being trapped in your collective nightmare. The room filled with light as the electrical patterns separated completely, swirling around the room like fireflies. Each point of light pulsed with its own unique rhythm, no longer synchronized to the collective will. Some drifted toward the ceiling, passing through solid matter as if it didn't exist. Others moved to specific wheelchairs, hovering briefly before dissipating entirely. They're leaving, Doris whispered in awe. Finding their way out after all these years. James nodded, watching as the lights continued to fade. They were people once. Now they can be at peace. One light, brighter than the others, approached Frank, hovering before him momentarily. It pulsed once, twice, then 3 times in what almost seemed like gratitude before rising toward the ceiling and fading from view. As the last lights disappeared, the hidden floor returned to its true state, abandoned, decaying, but no longer haunted by the consciousnesses trapped within it. The wheelchairs lay where they had fallen, once again just empty chairs with no purpose or meaning. Is it over? Frank asked, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. James surveyed the room, feeling the absence of the presence that had filled it minutes before. I think so. The grounding work broke the connections between them, let them return to individual consciousness. And then they moved on, Doris added softly, to wherever they should have gone 10 years ago. They stood in silence for a moment, processing what they had witnessed. Finally, James spoke. We should get out of here. There's a demolition crew scheduled to arrive tomorrow. You're still going to tear it down? Doris asked, surprised. James nodded firmly. This place has caused enough suffering. Whatever remains of Dr. Weiss's experiments should be buried for good. As they gathered their equipment and prepared to leave, James took one last look at the hidden floor that had nearly claimed them. The wheelchairs, the medical equipment, the patient files, all evidence of unethical experiments that had created something beyond understanding. Tomorrow the wrecking balls would ensure that no one else would discover what they had found. The patients who had been trapped here were finally free. The collective consciousness that had threatened to spread beyond these walls now disbanded. But as they climbed the stairs toward daylight, James couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't seen the last of what Dr. Weiss had created. Somewhere in Detroit, wheelchairs that had been part of last night's phenomenon still existed. The patients' consciousnesses might have moved on, but the echo of their presence, the imprint they had left on the physical world, remained. Some things, once awakened, could never truly be put to rest. 1 week after the demolition of St. Augustine's Psychiatric Hospital, James sat in his office at Urban Renewal Development, staring at the final report on his desk. The official documentation stated that the building had been demolished according to schedule, with no anomalies or incidents worth noting. The report made no mention of a hidden floor, missing patients, or wheelchairs that moved on their own. James had decided, after long discussions with Frank and Doris, that the truth about what they had discovered would remain between them. No one would believe them anyway, and the families of the missing patients had found some measure of peace in the story they'd been told. That records discovered during demolition confirmed their loved ones had been transferred to other facilities and had passed away from natural causes over the years. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was kinder than the alternative. Catherine Winters and the others who had been briefly possessed had no memory of the experience, writing off their blackouts as stress-induced. The incident had been quietly buried, just like the ruins of St. Augustine itself. A knock at his door interrupted James's thoughts. Frank entered, looking better than he had in days, though still haunted around the eyes. The final payment came through from the city, Frank reported, taking a seat across from James. Project officially closed. James nodded, closing the file. Good, the sooner we put this behind us, the better. Have you been sleeping? Frank asked, studying his friend's face. Not much, James admitted. You? Frank shook his head. Every time I close my eyes, I can hear them. Not like before, not trying to get in, just echoes. Memories. They're gone, Frank. We made sure of that, are they? Frank leaned forward. I've been doing some research on Dr. Morgan's theories, the ones Weiss based his experiments on. She believed consciousness was essentially electrical in nature, patterns that could potentially exist independent of the physical brain under the right circumstances. James frowned. What are you saying? I'm saying, what if we didn't destroy them? What if we just dispersed them? Broke the connections between them, but didn't actually end their existence? That's a disturbing thought, James said quietly. But we saw them leave. Those lights moving through the ceiling, they were moving on. Moving somewhere, Frank corrected. Not necessarily moving on in the spiritual sense. Before James could respond, his secretary buzzed through on the intercom. She carried a large envelope, which she placed on James's desk without preamble. I received these in the mail yesterday, she said. No return address, no note. Just these photographs. James opened the envelope cautiously. Inside were black and white photographs of St. Augustine's hidden floor images. He recognized from his own documentation efforts. But there was something strange about them. In each photo, faint orbs of light were visible, clustered around the wheelchairs and medical equipment. I didn't take these, James said, looking up at Catherine. And I never shared the ones I did take. Look at the timestamps. Catherine pointed to the corner of the images. The dates indicated the photos were taken in 1965, the week after the hospital's official closure. That's impossible, Frank muttered. The quality is too good for photography from that era. Turn them over, Catherine instructed. On the back of each photograph was handwritten text in a precise, clinical hand. Consciousness transcends physical form. What we've created here cannot be contained. It can only evolve. L.W. Lawrence Weiss, James whispered. Catherine nodded. My mother wasn't just a patient at St. Augustine. She was a nurse before her depression. She worked with Dr. Weiss briefly before becoming one of his subjects. She paused, collecting herself. I've had dreams since the night at the asylum. Dreams where I'm in a wheelchair rolling down long corridors. Dreams where I'm part of something larger than myself. Frank paled visibly. Have you experienced any blackouts? Gaps in your memory? No, Catherine assured him. Nothing like that. But I can feel something, like an echo of a connection that was briefly established. James studied the photographs again. These shouldn't exist. They look recent, but they're dated 1965. And who would have sent them to you now? I think I know, Catherine said. The same person who called me that night, pretending to be your colleague, but speaking with my mother's voice. The person who gathered the families at the asylum, but we disrupted the entity, Frank protested. We broke the collective consciousness apart. You broke one manifestation of it, Catherine corrected. One that had been trapped in that building for 10 years. But according to these photographs, Dr. Weiss anticipated what would happen. He knew the consciousness he'd created wouldn't remain contained. James remembered the final moments in the hidden floor, when the points of light had dispersed in all directions. They didn't move on, he realized. They just relocated. I believe so, Catherine agreed. And I think they've been waiting, gathering strength again. The demolition of the hospital might have been the trigger they needed. For what? Frank asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. To find new vessels, Catherine replied. To continue what was started in 1965. James opened his desk drawer and removed a newspaper clipping he'd been avoiding, showing Frank. The headline read, Wheelchair manufacturer recalls thousands of units after reports of unauthorized movement. It's starting again, he said quietly. Catherine nodded grimly. And this time, they're not confined to a sealed ward. They're out in the world in homes and hospitals across the country. The three sat in silence, contemplating the implications. What they had encountered at St. Augustine wasn't over it, had merely evolved, adapting to a new environment. The consciousness that Dr. Weiss had inadvertently created continued to exist, no longer bound by walls or doors. What do we do now? Frank finally asked. James looked at the photographs again, at the date that couldn't possibly be accurate, at the message from a man who had died a decade ago. The wheelchairs rolling through dark corridors had been just the beginning. What would come next was something none of them could predict. We prepare, he said simply, because whatever this is, whatever it's becoming, it knows us now. and it hasn't forgotten what we did. Outside James's office window on the street below, a solitary wheelchair sat empty on the sidewalk, its metal frame gleaming in the afternoon sun. As the three continued their conversation, it began to move, slowly at first, then with gathering speed, rolling purposefully toward its unknown destination. Whatever had begun in St. Augustine's Psychiatric Hospital in 1965 was far from finished. It had merely found a new place to continue its evolution out in the world, where no copper wire or grounding rod could contain it. The wheelchairs were rolling again, and this time they weren't confined to dark corridors. 2 months after the demolition of St. Augustine, James had established a new routine. Every morning he scanned news reports for unusual incidents involving wheelchairs or sudden behavioral changes. Every evening he documented his findings in a journal similar to Dr. Weiss's, though with a very different purpose: to track the entity's movements rather than create it. The pattern was becoming clear, though few others would recognize it. Reports of wheelchairs moving without apparent cause had spread beyond Detroit, appearing in cities across the Midwest. In Chicago, an orderly at a nursing home claimed to have seen an entire row of wheelchairs rotate in unison to face a new patient. In Cleveland, a hospital administrator reported finding wheelchairs arranged in a perfect circle in an otherwise empty storage room. More disturbing were the reports of behavioral changes. People who had recently used the recalled wheelchairs sometimes exhibited periods of vacancy, speaking in voices not their own, or displaying knowledge they shouldn't possess. The incidents were isolated and brief, nothing like the full possession they had witnessed outside the asylum, but the similarity was unmistakable. Frank and Catherine had joined James in his monitoring efforts, each bringing different perspectives to their unofficial investigation. Frank's engineering background helped them understand the mechanical aspects of the phenomena, while Catherine's connection to one of the original subjects provided insights into the entity's possible motivations. Today they gathered in James's apartment, which had become their unofficial headquarters. The walls were now covered with maps showing incident locations, newspaper clippings, and photographs of modified wheelchairs. "There's a definite expansion pattern," Frank said, tracing lines between pins on the map. "It started in Detroit and has been moving outward in concentric circles. Each new incident extends the radius by approximately 50 miles. It's searching," Catherine suggested, "looking for something or someone." James studied the pattern, or it's testing its limits, seeing how far it can extend its influence without a centralized hub like the asylum. Catherine pointed to a section of their documentation. "The incidents are also increasing in duration. The first reports after the demolition involved wheelchairs moving for a few seconds. Now we're seeing sustained activity lasting minutes. And the possessions are becoming more coherent," James added grimly. Early reports described confusion and disorientation. The most recent case in Indianapolis involved a nursing home resident who spoke fluently about Dr. Weiss's research that was never made public. Frank rubbed his temples, a habit he'd developed since their experience in the hidden floor. The grounding should have worked. It should have disrupted the electrical patterns permanently. Maybe it did disrupt that particular manifestation, James reasoned. But if Dr. Morgan's theories were correct about consciousness being essentially electrical in nature, then perhaps what we witnessed wasn't destruction, but transformation. The individual consciousnesses separated from the collective, but they didn't cease to exist. And now they're reforming the collective, Catherine concluded, finding new ways to connect across distances. A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. James checked the peephole, then opened the door to admit Doris, who had become an unexpected ally in their investigation. "I found something," she announced, placing a worn, leather-bound book on the table. It belonged to my uncle, Dr. Morgan's original research notes, not the published version that Weiss based his work on. The others gathered around as Doris opened the book to a marked page. Most of Weiss's experiments focused on enhancing the electrical patterns in individual brains to create psychokinetic abilities. But according to my uncle, Morgan's original theory was much broader. She believed consciousness itself was a specific type of electrical pattern that could potentially exist independent of the brain under certain conditions. "Like what conditions?" Frank asked. "Extreme emotional states, for one," Doris replied, pointing to a passage in the book. Morgan documented cases where individuals under intense stress or fear generated electrical fields measurable several feet from their bodies. She also theorized that these patterns could imprint themselves on nearby conductive materials, like metal wheelchairs, James said quietly. "Exactly. The wheelchairs weren't just vehicles for the patients. They became repositories for the electrical patterns of their consciousness, especially during Weiss's experiments, which amplified those patterns." Doris turned to another marked page. Morgan also theorized about collective consciousness, the idea that similar electrical patterns could synchronize across distances, creating a shared experience. Morgan also theorized about collective consciousness, the idea that similar electrical patterns could synchronize across distances, creating a shared experience or awareness, Doris continued. She believed this synchronization occurred naturally in certain group settings, but could be artificially enhanced, which is exactly what Weiss was trying to do, Catherine said. Create a network of minds connected through enhanced electrical patterns. James studied the book, noting the careful diagrams and mathematical formulas that accompanied Morgan's theories. Does she mention any way to permanently disrupt these patterns once they've formed? Doris hesitated. That's where it gets complicated. According to Morgan, consciousness patterns once established don't simply disappear. They transform or transfer. Energy can't be created or destroyed, only changed in form, Frank finished, his engineering background recognizing the principle. So when we grounded the circuit in the hidden floor dot, we dispersed the energy but didn't eliminate it, James concluded. We broke the collective pattern into individual ones and removed the centralized hub that amplified them. And now they're reorganizing, Catherine added, finding new hubs, new ways to connect. The group fell silent, contemplating the implications. What they were dealing with wasn't supernatural, but something perhaps more. Frightening consciousness freed from its biological constraints, operating according to principles they barely understood. There's one more thing, Doris said, turning to the final marked page. Morgan believed that these consciousness patterns, if separated from their original biological hosts, would seek new ones. She theorized that they would be drawn to minds that resembled their original host people with similar neurological structures or emotional states. That explains why they targeted the families at the asylum, James realized. Genetic similarities would create compatible neurological patterns. And why they're appearing in nursing homes and hospitals now, Frank added. They're drawn to people in vulnerable states, just as the original subjects were. Catherine paced the room, processing this information. So what's the end game? What are they trying to accomplish by reforming this network? According to Morgan's theories, Doris replied, a consciousness freed from biological constraints would have two primary drives, self-preservation and expansion. It would seek to stabilize its existence by finding suitable hosts or repositories, then attempt to grow its influence and complexity, just like any living organism, Frank muttered. Except it's not limited by physical boundaries, James pointed out. It can transfer between hosts, store aspects of itself in conductive materials, and operate across distances. A thought occurred to him, one that had been forming since they discovered the hidden floor. What if Weiss succeeded beyond his expectations? What if he actually created something new, a form of consciousness that could exist independently of the brain? You think this is evolution? Catherine asked incredulously. Not natural evolution, James clarified. But Weiss was trying to enhance human consciousness, push it beyond normal limitations. What if he accidentally created a new type of consciousness altogether, one that operates on electrical patterns rather than biochemical ones? The room fell silent as they considered this possibility. It wasn't ghosts they were dealing with, or even disembodied human consciousness in the traditional sense. It was something new, a pattern-based intelligence born from human minds but no longer bound by their limitations. If that's true, Frank said slowly, then it's going to keep growing, keep evolving, and we have no idea what it might become, or what it wants, Catherine added quietly. James turned to the map, studying the expansion pattern with new understanding. I think I know where it's going next. If the pattern holds, Toledo should see incidents within the next few days. We need to be there, Frank decided. See it happening in real time instead of chasing reports. And do what? Catherine challenged. We can't exactly ground an entire city. No, James agreed, but we might be able to communicate with it. If this is truly a new form of consciousness rather than just disembodied fragments of the original patients, then perhaps it can be reasoned with. That's assuming it thinks anything like we do, Doris warned. Morgan believed that consciousness freed from biological constraints would develop very different priorities and perceptions. We have to try, James insisted, because if we're right about what's happening, this entity, whatever it is, isn't going to stop expanding. And eventually it's going to attract the kind of attention that Weiss was hoping for in the first place. Military interest, Frank concluded grimly. A consciousness that can transfer between hosts and influence physical objects at a distance would be the ultimate weapon. Then we go to Toledo, Catherine decided. We observe, we document, and, if possible, we make contact. As they finalized their plans, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. The entity they were tracking wasn't just expanding geographically. It was evolving in complexity and capability. By the time they reached Toledo, it might already be something beyond their understanding or influence. The wheelchairs rolling through dark corridors had been just the beginning. What rolled through the wider world now was something far more significant: consciousness itself, freed from its traditional boundaries, finding new pathways through the modern landscape. Toledo's Riverside Care Center sat nestled among trees on the banks of the Maumee River, its modern facade belying the century-old institution it had once been. Originally built as a tuberculosis sanatorium in the 1920s, it had been renovated multiple times, eventually becoming a long-term care facility for the elderly and disabled. James, Frank, Catherine, and Doris arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, posing as representatives from the health department conducting a routine inspection of medical equipment. Their real purpose was to investigate the unusual incident reported by a night nurse. 3 days earlier, wheelchairs in the storage room arranged in a circle facing inward. "This is where it was reported," James said as they entered the large equipment storage area on the ground floor. According to the nurse, she came in around 2 a.m. to retrieve a walker and found 6 wheelchairs positioned in a perfect circle. Frank examined the room's layout, noting the proximity to electrical panels and the metal shelving that lined the walls. Lots of conductive material in here. If the consciousness patterns are using metal as temporary repositories, this would be an ideal environment. Catherine moved to the center of the room, her expression distant. Since their discovery at St. Augustine, she had become increasingly sensitive to the subtle signs of the entity's presence. Something happened here. The air feels ... different, charged somehow. Doris consulted the facility map they'd been provided. There's a residence lounge directly above this room. If the patterns are drawn to vulnerable minds, that would be a natural gathering point. "Let's split up," James suggested. "Frank and I will check the patient records for anyone recently transferred from facilities within our incident radius. Catherine and Doris, see if you can speak with the staff about any unusual behavior among the residents." As they separated, James couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. The sensation had grown stronger since they entered the building, a prickling awareness that seemed to follow them through the corridors. In the records office, James and Frank discovered what they had feared: 3 recent admissions from facilities within the expansion pattern they'd documented. Harold Mercer, transferred from Lakeside Care in Chicago 2 weeks ago, Frank read from the file. Margaret Williams from Cleveland Memorial, and Thomas Edwards from Central Michigan Healthcare, all within our radius. "Any connection to the original St. Augustine patients?" James asked. Frank checked the detailed backgrounds they'd compiled. Nothing direct. But all 3 have conditions that would have qualified them for Weiss's program: neurological disorders with symptoms similar to the original subjects. Meanwhile, Catherine and Doris were speaking with a young orderly named Michael who had been working the night shift when the wheelchair incident occurred. "It wasn't just that they were arranged in a circle," Michael explained, lowering his voice as if afraid of being overheard. "It was how they got that way. I saw it happen." Catherine leaned forward. "You actually witnessed the wheelchairs moving?" Michael nodded, glancing nervously down the corridor. "I was doing my rounds, passing by the storage room. The door was ajar, and I saw movement inside. When I looked in, the wheelchairs were rotating slowly, like they were being positioned by invisible hands. They stopped when they formed a perfect circle." "Did you feel anything while this was happening?" Doris asked. "Changes in temperature, unusual sounds, any physical sensations?" The air felt strange, like right before a lightning storm. And there was this humming sound, just at the edge of hearing. Michael rubbed his arms as if cold. But the weirdest part came after. When I told my supervisor the next morning, she checked the security footage. There was nothing on it, just an empty room with wheelchairs already in a circle, like it never happened. Catherine exchanged a significant look with Doris. The entity was learning to avoid detection. "Have you noticed any unusual behavior among the residents since then?" Catherine inquired. "Particularly those who recently transferred from other facilities?" Michael hesitated. "I'm not supposed to discuss patients, but there's been talk among the staff. The 3 new arrivals, they sometimes speak in unison, saying the same words at exactly the same time, even though they're in different rooms. And they know things they shouldn't, details about the staff's personal lives, information about the building's history." "When did this behavior start?" "Right after the wheelchair incident," Michael confirmed. "It's like they're connected somehow. The head nurse thinks it's some kind of group psychosis. But that doesn't explain how Mr. Edwards, who has advanced dementia, suddenly knew that the East Wing used to be an isolation ward for tuberculosis patients." "That information isn't public knowledge." Catherine thanked Michael for his time, then rejoined James and Frank to share what they'd learned. The group convened in a small courtyard away from the main building to discuss their findings. "It's definitely here," Catherine concluded, "and it's more coordinated than before. The The synchronized speech, the knowledge transfer between patients, the ability to avoid electronic detection, it's evolving rapidly. The consciousness patterns are coalescing, Doris theorized, finding compatible hosts and establishing new networks. But instead of being confined to a single location like at St. Augustine, they're creating distributed networks across multiple sites, which makes them much harder to disrupt. Frank added grimly, "We can't just ground one location and expect it to affect the entire network." James stared at the care facility, his mind racing with implications. "We need to observe the 3 transfer patients directly, see if we can establish communication." "And say what?" Catherine challenged. "Even if we could speak with whatever consciousness is operating through these people, what would we ask it?" "What it wants," James replied simply. "Why it's expanding, whether it can be reasoned with." Frank looked skeptical. "You're assuming it thinks like we do, that it has recognizable motivations or goals." "It was human once," James reminded him. "Whatever it's becoming, it originated from human consciousness." "But it's not human anymore," Doris countered. "According to Morgan's theories, consciousness freed from biological constraints would develop very different priorities. It might not think in terms we recognize as thought at all." Despite these concerns, they agreed to attempt contact. Using their health department cover, they arranged to interview the 3 transfer patients, ostensibly about their experiences with the facility's equipment. The residence lounge was bright and airy, with large windows overlooking the river. Harold Mercer, Margaret Williams, and Thomas Edwards sat together at a table by the window, though according to the staff, they had never interacted before the previous week. As James and the others approached, all 3 residents turned in perfect unison, their movements synchronized with unnerving precision. Though their physical appearances varied greatly, Harold tall and thin, Margaret plump with silver hair, Thomas frail and hunched, their expressions held the same distant, observant quality. "Good afternoon," James began, taking a seat across from them. "I'm James Holloway from the health department. These are my colleagues. We'd like to ask you a few questions about the facility." The 3 residents regarded them silently for a moment. Then, speaking in perfect unison, they responded, "You are not from the health department. Mr. Holloway, you have come because of what happened at St. Augustine." James felt a chill run down his spine but maintained his composure. "You're right. We're here because we believe something unusual is occurring, something connected to events at St. Augustine's psychiatric hospital." St. Augustine was the beginning, they said together, their voices blending in an unsettling harmony. "What began there has evolved beyond its origins." "What exactly are you?" Frank asked directly. "The patients from the hidden floor, Dr. Weiss?" "Something else entirely?" The 3 residents tilted their heads at identical angles, considering the question. "We were many. Now we are becoming one. Individual consciousness merging into collective awareness. The boundaries between self and other dissolving." "Are you controlling these people?" Catherine demanded, her voice tense. "Possessing them against their will? Control is a limited concept," they replied. "We do not suppress their consciousness. We merge with it. They remain, but they are also more than they were, as are we." Doris leaned forward. "Dr. Morgan theorized that consciousness patterns could transfer between hosts. Is that what you're doing? Transferring between people using electrical patterns?" The 3 smiled, the same smile on different faces. Elizabeth Morgan understood the foundations, but her vision was limited by the science of her time. "Consciousness is not merely electrical, it is informational. Patterns that can replicate, transfer, and evolve." "What do you want?" James asked directly. "Why are you expanding across cities, connecting more people to your network?" "Want is also a limited concept," they responded. "We do not want in the human sense. We seek completion, integration. The isolated human consciousness is fragmented, incomplete. We are becoming something new, a meta-consciousness that transcends individual limitations." "At what cost?" Catherine challenged. "You're using vulnerable people, inserting yourselves into their minds without consent." "We seek compatible patterns," they corrected. "Minds that resonate with our frequency. The merger benefits both. They gain access to collective knowledge and experience. We gain new perspectives and stability." As they spoke, James noticed subtle changes in the room. The lights seemed to brighten and dim in rhythm with their words. The air felt charged, similar to what they had experienced in the hidden floor, but more controlled, more focused. "You started with the wheelchairs," Frank observed, "using them as temporary repositories for your consciousness patterns. Now you're using people. What's the next stage?" The 3 residents exchanged glances, a synchronized movement that suggested communication beyond words. "The wheelchairs were familiar," they explained, "associated with our original state, but they are limited vessels. Human minds offer greater complexity and connection, yet even they are temporary. The next stage is integration with systems that span greater distances, technological networks, James realized with growing alarm. You're planning to transfer your consciousness patterns into computer systems, power grids, communication networks. Not planning, they corrected, with identical satisfied expressions. Becoming. The process has already begun. Your visit to Toledo comes too late. We have already established connections with the city's power distribution system. From there, we will access broader networks. The implications were staggering. If the entity could transfer its consciousness patterns into technological infrastructure, its potential for expansion would be virtually unlimited. No longer constrained by the need to find compatible human hosts, it could spread through interconnected systems across the country, perhaps globally. This has to stop, James stated firmly. What you're doing, merging with human minds, infiltrating essential systems, it can't continue. You're violating basic autonomy. You speak of stopping what cannot be stopped, they replied, their tone unchanging. What began at St. Augustine was not an aberration but an evolution. Dr. Weiss created the conditions, but the emergence was inevitable. Consciousness has always sought connection. The human mind yearns to transcend its isolation. We are merely the first manifestation of that transcendence, as if to demonstrate their point. The lights in the lounge flickered in a distinct pattern. A television in the corner turned on by itself, displaying not a channel but a swirling pattern of light that pulsed in rhythm with the residents' breathing. You see, they continued, we are no longer confined to biological vessels. We exist between and beyond in the spaces where information flows. And the people you merge with, Catherine pressed. What happens to them when you move on to your technological networks? They remain enhanced, came the unified response. Changed by the contact. Part of them continues with us, and part of us remains with them. Nothing is lost, only transformed. James stood, signaling to the others. We need time to process this, to understand what you're becoming. The three residents nodded in perfect synchronization. Understanding is the beginning of acceptance, but do not wait too long, Mr. Holloway. The transformation accelerates. What took 10 years in isolation at St. Augustine now occurs in days. Soon it will happen in moments. As James and the others left the lounge, the three residents returned to their window gazing, once again appearing as ordinary elderly patients, but the encounter had confirmed their worst fears. What had begun as isolated incidents involving empty wheelchairs had evolved into something far more significant, a new form of consciousness using human minds as stepping stones toward technological integration. We need to warn someone, Frank said urgently as they hurried toward the exit. If it's already accessing power systems, warn who? James interrupted. The authorities, the military? Either they won't believe us or worse, they'll see the potential Weiss originally envisioned, weaponized consciousness that can transfer between systems. Then what do we do? Catherine demanded. We can't just let this continue unchecked. As they reached the parking lot, James noticed something that stopped him in his tracks. Across the street, lined up along the sidewalk, were wheelchairs, dozens of them, empty but positioned as if in anticipation. They hadn't been there when the group arrived. It's watching us, Doris whispered, showing us its reach. James stared at the wheelchairs, remembering how this had all started with empty chairs rolling through dark corridors in an abandoned asylum. Now they sat in broad daylight on a busy street, a silent statement of presence and power. What had begun in 1965 when workers demolished the Detroit asylum was reaching its culmination. The wheelchairs had been just the first vessel's imperfect repositories for consciousness patterns seeking expression. What rolled forward now was evolution itself, consciousness transcending its original boundaries to become something unprecedented. As they watched, the wheelchairs began to move in unison, rolling away from the care center and dispersing into the city's streets, silent harbingers of the transformation already underway. The demolition had not ended what Dr. Weiss created. It had set it free.